Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation, our webinar on pollinator conservation and working landscapes with Nick Haddad. Before I introduce Nick, I want to take some time to let everyone know about some upcoming events. Next week, we have a webinar on 100 plants to feed the monarch butterflies, which is a reschedule from December. And in February 22nd and 23rd, 29th annual and Eco Marketplace, which will be held 100% virtually. Registration is now open. I will be sure to pop that in the chat towards the end of today's call. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Nick. Dr. Nick Haddad is a professor of integrative biology at Michigan State University. He is also director of the long-term ecological research site at Kellogg Biological Station. He studies landscape conservation and the rarest butterflies in the world. And without further ado, Nick, if you want to take us away, thank you so much.
Yeah, hey everybody, thanks for having me and good to be able to chat with you. Yes, go Spartans. By the way, when I'm talking, I won't, sorry, my presentation, I won't be able to see the chat. So Maz, if you feel free to interrupt me. I was telling Maz, if you like have questions or things to discuss as we go along, then please feel free to like put something in the chat or yeah, and I'm happy to pause as we go along. And so I'm just going to jump in, but I'll tell you, let's see, share the screen, go. Okay, good. Okay. And so I'm going to tell you just as starters, like where I'm coming from as I give my presentation. I am a landscape ecologist who thinks about conserving working landscapes for biodiversity and for the services that ecosystems make for people, ecosystem services. And I'm also, I do work on landscape conservation from an experimental point of view. So I'm going to tell you about some big long-term experiments that I've done as I weave my way through my story. But as you know, the title of my talk is about pollinator conservation, but what I really know about is butterflies. And so I wrote this book a few years ago about my work on the rarest butterflies in the world, and I'll tell you about just a little bit about the rarest butterflies. But when so I've wound two butterflies and conservation of pollinators. I didn't always see myself this way, but when I did learn as an undergraduate or decide that I wanted to be an ecologist, I knew I wanted to work with birds at the time. And I thought I was going to go to graduate school to study birds. And but after I graduated undergraduate, I had this great opportunity to spend 2 years in tropical environments. For every ecologist, that's the dream, is to see the diversity of tropical forests. And I didn't really think about what I was doing. I was working for a biologist, an ecologist, and doing conservation work, but didn't think about my day-to-day. I just wanted to go to the tropics. But when it really dawned on me what I was doing, I was dropped into a fairly remote area of Guatemala with three things: with a tent to live in the woods for a couple of years, a mountain bike to get around on like tropical forest trails, like walking trails, and then a butterfly net. And that's when I was like thrown into the world of butterflies. I knew nothing about butterflies, and the people that dropped me there knew that I knew nothing. And so they just said, look, collect everything, collect butterflies and send them back to experts in the United States. And so that's what I did for 2 years. I collected butterflies. I don't know how many samples I sent back, thousands, I think. And it was only a few years later after I'd returned that I got to read a paper that my collaborator read that told me that I caught 535 different species of butterflies. And so that was interesting, the diversity. But what was more interesting to me than that was that paper I got the next year that told about all the species I found that were new to science that had never been seen before. And one of these butterflies was so different that it was not just a new species, it was a new genus. So this is like an ostrich is a species in its own genus. Humans are a species in our own genus. So this was a really different thing. It was a lineage that was potentially millions of years old that I discovered, and I got to like read through this article telling why it's different, and um, and getting to the Latinized name of the butterfly. Here I'm thinking, oh man, this thing's going to be cool. Like, what did they name it? Read along the story about why it's different to the very end. Get to the name for the butterfly. And this is, I kid you not, the name Inglorious Mediocris, the mediocre butterfly. And maybe you could get that from the brown, whatever, small brown form, but there are a lot of small brown butterflies. None of them have this name. But I'm telling you about this in part because I caught 2 of these butterflies, and since then there have been caught 3 more. So there have only been 5 ever captured. And what this impressed on me is how, just the question, how rare is this butterfly? And could butterflies be this rare? And like, how are we going to think about conserving them? I actually don't think this butterfly is so rare. It's just like it's mediocre, so butterfly collectors aren't like out seeking this one. But that was the start of my work with butterflies. And then if I fast forward to now and I think about butterflies, pollinators, insects in general, then I see articles like this, and this was in the New York Times about the insect apocalypse and speaking to what we're observing as this dramatic decline in numbers of insects. And I'll talk about that for a second, in a second. But what I want to tell you about that's the bookends, like my introduction to butterflies and rare butterflies on one end, this potential catastrophic decline of butterflies, pollinators, and insects on the other end. And then where my heart is wondering, what can we do to conserve rare butterflies and other insects? And so what I'm going to do in my talk is go through in 4 stages. I'm just going to have a few slides on butterflies. So this talk is about pollinators, but I'm a butterfly biologist, so I want to just say a few words about butterflies as pollinators. And then I'm going to talk about the decline of butterflies, and that leads to decline of other insects in general. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the rarest butterflies in the world and how to conserve them. And that winds around to my interest and the kind of theme that I think is most important for you all, thinking about how to conserve landscapes for butterflies, for pollinators, and for biodiversity in general. So I hope that makes sense. You're getting kind of my interests that then lead into broader interests for landscape conservation. Okay, so let me start with butterflies as pollinators. Now, we know butterflies, they're not the most important pollinators. If I had to make a list, we'd start with bees, then bees and wasps, and then flies. And there are other species that pollinate, but butterflies fall down on the list and in importance. And I'd always wondered, like, how, we kind of lump butterflies in with other pollinators, and is that a fair thing to do? So I had a student, former student, Sarah Cusser, who had this great data set for cotton. She worked in cotton fields where cotton is obligated to be pollinated, to produce. And she studied she just observed plants and observed what species of insects came to the flowers, when they came. She observed their behavior, which of them were carrying pollen to take them to other plants. And what she found with respect to butterflies really amazed me. butterflies are worth about 10% of the pollination of cotton. Now, cotton, of course, is a cash crop, and if you add the value of butterflies as pollinators for cotton, it turns out that the value of those butterflies is $60 million a year. And so the question is, why is it that butterflies, by the way, $60 billion a year, we're talking about $1 billion just in Texas, so they're worth more than that to cotton in general, but they're 60 million relative to a $1 billion industry in the state of Texas. So why is it that butterflies serve a role as pollinators that other species can't take up? What extra are the butterflies taking up? So this is a graphic of a cotton plant, and it's not like, don't like stare at the details. The key points of this are first that there's two ways that the insects divide up space. They divide up the plant. They divide it up in time of day, time of year, so in time, and then in space across the plant. And so it turns out that butterflies, they are pollinating earlier in the day, earlier in the season. So they're like earlier in the season, there are flowers that are out, and if it weren't for butterflies, then the flowers would go unpollinated. And then they forage on different parts of the plant. So if you kind of follow the arrow that goes right up the center of the plant, and then there's another arrow that goes outwards. Each of those white dots is a node from where cotton flowers emerge. And butterflies tend to forage out on the ends of the leaves. They're not like getting into the flowers that are in the interior of the plant. So they pollinate a different space. So the point is to say that yes, butterflies are pollinators too. They're important pollinators in some respects, and they're, of course, depends across the plant species. But I also think butterflies are a good model for understanding pollinators in general, because we know a lot about butterflies. Okay, so then that leads me to the second part of my talk. And when I think about landscape conservation, that's where my mind goes, but then conservation of what? And so I'm going to start with thinking about the loss of butterflies, and then how butterflies can indicate what's happening with other pollinators. So I had a student, Tyson Weprick, who got into this cool data set for butterflies. And it's a data set that comes from across the state of Ohio. Every one of these points on this map, the colored dots, are places where people survey for butterflies along transect. So they basically walk a path, think about a mile in length, and they don't just walk it once, they walk it every week during the growing season. And they've done so for every year up to over 20 years. And so there's this incredible record of butterflies from across the state and across decades of time. The great thing about this study, and there are other butterfly studies like this, is that it's not just scientists out there doing some scientific study. This is a great example of a project with citizen science, where any of us who are interested in butterflies could go out, we could learn the butterfly species. That's the great thing about butterflies. They're not too hard to learn. And then do the surveys and report the data back that become part of this bigger data set. Okay, so there's this large scale long-term study, and my student Tyson asked, well, what is the pattern of butterfly abundance over time? So that's what this first graph is. So what he did is summed up all the butterflies caught across all the species and asked, what's the change in abundance? And so this is an index of abundance, but going over the course of nearly 20 years. And what you see is a decline. And the decline is about 2% per year. Now, 2%, like that might not seem like a big number. If you go out 1 year and you see 100 butterflies in your backyard, and the next year you go out and see, 98. It's hardly noticeable. But it's a 2% decline per year. So over 20 years, it means that if you went out and saw 100 butterflies, 20 years ago, that you'd see 70 butterflies this year. So a big decline. And the scary thing about this trend is that it's ongoing, that we don't know how the butterflies are declining quickly. We don't know how quickly, for how long this decline will continue. Okay, so this is for all the insects together, but then you could ask, well, what about individual insects? Are they declining or increasing? And turns out some are going in both directions. More are declining than increasing. Like monarchs, well, they're declining. And we know, not just from Ohio, but from mainly studies in Mexico where they are right now over winter, we know that they're declining quickly. But it's not just butterflies that we care about in conservation like monarchs. Even common weedy butterflies are declining. So this is the cabbage white. When I ask people what butterflies they know, most people know monarchs. The next most common butterfly that people know are cabbage whites, because the cabbage whites, well, we see their caterpillars in our gardens on broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. Anyway, this is one of the only invasive species it's invasive across most of the world. And so it should be thriving in the, around towns, around people, but it's declining as well. Now, not all butterflies are declining. Some are increasing, and we think we can explain why some are even increasing. So this is a butterfly, the indigo dusty wing, and it feeds on a plant called crown vetch, and crown vetch is a common weed on roadsides. And so, as we extend our roads and our cities and such, well, habitat actually can become more available for it. And then this is another butterfly, the gem satyr. It is increasing. And what we think is that the gem satyr's range extends up into Ohio. Ohio's the northern part. So as Ohio becomes warmer over time, it becomes more like the conditions where the butterfly is in most of its range. And so it's actually able to benefit from some changes in climate. Okay, so that's what's going on in Ohio. There's a decline of butterflies of 2% per year, and this is leading to huge declines over decades. Well, Tyson, my student who did this work, said, well, if we're finding this in Ohio, is it just something happening in Ohio? Like, are there other possibilities in other places of the world that butterflies are doing better or worse? And so he went to the literature and said, well, what are other scientists finding where there are studies like this? And there's only a few other studies that are of this like duration, decades long, and over this large of regions, like comparable to the state of Ohio. And those surveys are in the UK, the Netherlands, Spain, and Catalonia. And what is, so just to put this in perspective, like the weight of these studies, they occur over decades, 2 to 4 decades. They occur at hundreds to thousands of sites across the region. And then there are thousands, hundreds of thousands to millions of butterflies observed per year through these studies that are spread throughout the region. And what was just astounding to me is that every study found the same rate of decline of butterflies, about 2% per year. So it's not just something that's happening in Ohio. It's something that's happening more broadly. And so again, 2% per year, like that might seem like whatever, not so much, but if you extend it over the course of the 2 to 4 decades of the studies, it's somewhere between 33% decline and 63% decline, with declines ongoing. I mean, this is huge, the amount of insects being lost. And the question is, how or when are we going to see impact of this on our ecological systems that first depend on butterflies, but then even more remarkably, about 2 years ago, a group did a analysis of all the long-term studies that have been done on any kind of insect across the world and asked what is the rate of change in insect populations abundances over time. And guess what the answer is? Decline of 2% per year of all insects on land. So I guess the message to convey is we have a problem. We have a problem with butterflies, with insects, including pollinators. And what I argue is that butterflies are a great indicator of what's happening to the rest of insects. That's been confirmed through this big global study that I mentioned. But the thing about butterflies is that we can do the long-term regional studies fairly easily because people, not just scientists, but people can get out and do the studies and can contribute to the science. I mean, that's what's happening in all these studies I'm showing you, is that it's not just scientists doing their kind of research projects for their own labs. It's getting people interested in butterflies to go out and do the studies and contribute to the science to understand populations. I should just ask, are there any, if you have any questions, maybe this is a good
Sorry, there is
stopping.
one question in the chat.
Yeah, okay. I'm turning off I can now see my screen. I don't know
It says, Anne has asked about the insect decline table. Your chart has UK over 41 years and others over 20. Is the UK decline for the first 20 years also at 2.4%, or has it increased in recent years?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Our estimate is over the whole 40 years. And then the question about whether there's been increase, ironically, I know the answer for moths and not for butterflies from the UK. The UK is particularly good at these. They have several different kinds of organisms they do these studies for. And the odd thing for the moths is that it appears that back in the 70s, there was actually some increase in the number of moths. But then since then, there's been a steady ongoing decline. And so then in the global study, not just of butterflies, but of all insects, there's also been evidence of ongoing decline. And so it's worrisome because, well, frankly, what's the most worrisome is that we don't know the full cause for the decline. Like, it'd be nice to have just one thing that we could pinpoint. And just as an example, we all worry about the potential effects of toxic pesticides. And as it turns out, a new kind of pesticide, neonicotinoids, were introduced in the mid-90s, and a lot of the decline is correlated with the arrival of those pesticides. But still, we don't know. There's other things that are happening as well. Habitat amount is changing, and climate is warming, and climate fluctuations are becoming more erratic. And so I really think one of the great challenges for science right now is understanding the causes of insect decline. And when I say challenges for science, I'm talking about across all of science, because our life support systems depend on, not just pollinators, but depend on insects. And that decline is not sustainable. Go on, or any other questions?
That is the only question thus far in the chat, but I'll be sure to ping you if another one comes up.
All right, I'll go into the next section, and then I'll have another stopping point. So that'll be okay. So I also, so when I got into butterflies, I'm an experimental ecologist, and that'll come through as I go on through the talk. But I got into experiments that were really kind of model experiments. They were working on common butterflies, and I was interested in, well, what does this work mean for butterflies that are truly in need of conservation? And that took me into a path of working on rarest butterflies in the world. And so when I say rare, how rare are the rarest butterflies. What this graphic is showing is species across the horizontal axis, and then their global population size on the vertical axis. So we got monarchs on the far left. And as it kind of goes off the charts, when I made this graphic, there were over 30 million monarchs. Now there are over 200 million monarchs. They fluctuate in size. That's a different story. I'm not going to talk about monarchs. But the ones that I'm most interested in are starting with Fender's blue and going to the right, where the numbers are in the tens of thousands, the thousands, or even the hundreds. Like in the whole world, if there are hundreds of or thousands of a certain butterfly, if you kind of gather them all up and smash them into a ball, they'd be a ball like the size of maybe a softball or maybe a little bigger or smaller. I mean, these are so rare, they're on the verge of extinction. But I'm going to tell you just a quick story about one of those, the St. Francis satyr. So this is a butterfly that I've been studying for 2 decades, and its total global population numbers is about 3,000. So there are not many left in the world. And this slide shows the distribution of St. Francis satyr in blue. And yes, it's that one little point that's in southern North Carolina. And so it's in a small area, small population size. And here I am in its habitat. And I've got a smile on my face because I'm standing next to a population of about 30 of these butterflies. So 30 out of 3,000, it's a huge part of the whole population. But I've got a bigger smile on my face because I'm in the center of its range that also happens to be at an Army base, and not just anywhere in the Army base, but in the artillery range of that Army base. So I got a big smile because, well, I made it without stepping on some unexploded ordnance or putting myself in harm's way. And so there's this crazy butterfly in, crazy in its distribution and crazy in its rarity. And let me just give you a sense for where the butterfly occurs. And this does get into my interest in landscape. So the butterfly occurs along streams. And so what I've got are these green blobs are areas of habitat along the stream. It's not along the whole streamway, but these green areas are open wetlands along the stream. So this picture is a view of the habitat. You can see the grassy plants. There's sedges that are the caterpillar's food plant. And then what's interesting about these environments is it's in North Carolina, so it changes very quickly. So on the left side is the butterfly's habitat. So these sedge plants are kind of strewn throughout the environment. And then on the right side is it just, 6-8 years later, the forests are so productive that first shrubs move in, then trees move in, and they shade out the butterfly's food. So what is in 1 year suitable habitat for the butterfly, a few years later is unsuitable habitat. So then how is suitable habitat maintained? And turns out there's a key role for natural disturbances. And the disturbances, these are open grassy wetlands. The key disturbances are beaver. So beaver create dams. And then the butterflies aren't living where there's beaver ponds, but rather when the ponds are abandoned, then the mucky conditions create conditions for the sedges to thrive. And then in dry years, fires will burn through this landscape and trees and shrubs will be eliminated and the grassy plants thrive. So a key point is that over time, those natural disturbances have been removed from the landscape or had been, and the butterfly makes it again. Has declined. And what we've been trying to do is understand how to take advantage of the disturbances. But what's interesting is that in the bomb ranges, bombs set fires every year, and they've done a better job of mimicking natural disturbances than people people have done because we keep fire off of our landscape. And so that's how you end up with those butterflies there. So what we've done, what we know is that the butterflies live in these open wetlands. Those wetlands are going to succeed towards shrublands and forests. And so then there have to be new sites. Those are my red areas here that are created by disturbance. And there has to be butterfly ability to move between old areas that are good and becoming worse and new areas that then become better. And this speaks to my interest in landscapes because these rivers serve as dispersal corridors to get butterflies from one place to the other. But another part then to our work is trying to mimic the disturbances that the butterflies need. And so we do things like set prescribed fires and do other disturbances. And by the way, there's this whole interesting other part to the talk that I'm not going to give, but we have to be willing to disturb areas where the butterflies, these rare butterflies even are. We have to be willing to know that some butterflies will be lost in the disturbance process. But if we don't disturb the habitats through fire or other means, then the habitat will become bad. We're basically killing them anyway by keeping the disturbances out. That's another story. But we use fire, we use wetlands. This is my second favorite tool in my toolbox. So my favorite is a butterfly net. My next favorite is this thing called an aqua dam that helps to make temporary wetlands. So it's like an inner tube. This one is, I think, 3 feet wide and 2 feet high. And you just fill it with the water from the stream. So it creates this dam, and you kind of look behind the dam to the right. We're not trying to create a big pond. We're trying to saturate the soils. And so you see standing water, but quickly that is lost from view and the butterfly's habitat can persist. Okay, so we went out and did this. We created dams. We did the other things that beavers do. We removed the hardwoods that had grown in. And so we have an infinite pool of energy and students at the university to get this restoration work done. And then we asked, what is the effect of that restoration on the butterfly? And this is just one example. The butterfly, it turns out, was discovered in 1983, and it was thought to be in one population, but no disturbance was happening, and the population was quickly lost. They didn't know about the butterflies in the artillery ranges. But at this one population site, there were no butterflies in the 90s, the 2000s. That's when I started working there. And then we started this big restoration experiment in 2011. And very quickly, the butterfly population took off. There's a little bit of a sleight of hand right at the beginning because we had to introduce butterflies that we took from the artillery range. But once we'd seeded the population grew very rapidly. And to put this into perspective, I told you there's 3,000 of these butterflies. Well, there were 700 butterflies in this population. So a quarter of the world's butterflies are in the one place that we restored. And so we're trying to mimic this effort more broadly. This work, just a couple of years ago, this work was, for those of you who listen to podcasts, it was featured on Radiolab. And the title of it's Of Bombs and Butterflies, so you can just Google that name. But I have to say that Radiolab did a better job telling the story of the St. Francis Seder than I could ever do. They just weave that story together so nicely and bring in so many different characters that, I was really pleased with what they did. And if you're interested, yeah, definitely check it out. Okay, so I've told you about butterfly declines and then thinking about recovery, like of the St. Francis Seder with disturbance. But what my true interest in is managing landscapes for biodiversity. And I'm going to tell you two ways that I think about that, and they're both focused on experiments that I do. And so the first place I'm thinking about managing landscapes for pollinator biodiversity is in agricultural landscapes in Michigan and the upper Midwestern US. So working in corn, soy dominated landscapes and thinking about not just the fields, but the diversity of habitats in the whole landscape, so including the managed and unmanaged areas. And with the unmanaged areas, there can be an increase in resources and complexity and connectivity that help the whole landscape, including the agricultural land parts of the landscape, to thrive. And so I'm going to give you one example of how we've done that from experiments we've done at where I work, Kellogg Biological Station in Southwest Michigan. And so this is a typical view of my world. These squares are experimental plots that are each 1 hectare, 2.5 acres in size. And there are treatments that are crops, corn, soy, wheat. And then there are some natural areas that are different colors. Anyway, I'm going to tell you about one way that we think about landscape diversity for biodiversity conservation. Now, don't pay attention too much to this slide, but I want to tell you that the experiment varies along a gradient of land use intensity. So if I start on the left, we're looking at conventional agriculture. And then if I go all the way to the right, we're thinking about basically grasslands, conservation lands. And then we're thinking about other kinds of agriculture in between. So conventional no-till agriculture, agriculture with reduced chemical inputs, or organic, biologically based agriculture. That's, again, the world, just to give you a sense of the world I live in. You don't need to know all the details, but the one detail you do need to know is that we've added what we call prairie strips to some areas. And so in our least intense farming areas, the reduced chemical input and organic system, we've dedicated 5% of the plot area to natural areas. And so what do these prairie strips look like? I mean, this is it. They're just strips of land that run through corn, soy regions, and they're becoming more popular over time. And we installed them in our study, and here's a little video of what they look like after a few years. We call them prairie strips. They're not true prairie. We selected 22 plants to seed. And how did we choose those plants? Well, we wanted them to be optimized for their function, optimized for having flowers in these strips throughout the year to promote pollinators, to have structured vegetation to promote abundance of insects that are predators that could help to control pests and other kinds of functions. And so we created these kind of what we thought of as optimal habitats, and that's how they affect biodiversity and conservation. And so we measured various things in these landscapes. Each of these symbols, well, relates to butterfly diversity or beetle diversities, ants, spiders, and then yield. So we, of course, we want to know the yield of the whole plot, pollination. We think about decomposition. We're focused at our site on greenhouse gas emissions, so especially carbon storage in the soils, so CO2, and then we do a lot of work in microbial ecology. And I'm just going to give you a couple examples of the kinds of things we found. And so I have to, of course, start with butterflies and pollinators. And let me tell you how to read this graph. 0 is just a standardization of a starting point relative to conventional agriculture. And going left or right means that there's more than in conventional agriculture or less. So anything to the right, as you see here, means more diversity of butterflies, and there's higher diversity in the plots with prairie strips. So those are the bottom 2 lines. So prairie strips have an impact. That's true for butterflies. It's also true for spiders that are predators of potential pests. So these prairie strips are increasing diversity, as we hope, not just in the strips themselves, but in the rest of the plot. And how does that diversity affect function? Well, we measured pollination. And what we did is we put potted plants of black-eyed Susan out in the plots in various places so we could measure where pollinators were and how well they were allowing the plants to produce seeds. Sorry, this is like on some auto advance. But we found that the prairie strips could increase the rate of pollination. And so what are we thinking is happening? Well, what we want is that these prairie strips to be sources of pollinators or predatory insects, and then for their effects to spill over into the croplands. And so we measured how far, for example, pollinators are going out into the croplands. And that's what this graphic shows. On the x-axis is distance, the horizontal axis, distance from the prairie strip. And then on the vertical axis is the proportion of germinated seeds, so the amount of pollination. And what you can see is that as you go out from the strips, you get less and less pollination. So it's just evidence to us that the strips are increasing the number of pollinators and then having an effect, but that effect dissipates as you go out. Now, we also ask questions about, well, are farmers willing to put in prairie strips? And more they are, but it also can depend on compensation. So we have this program called the Conservation Reserve Program that pays farmers to take some lands out of crop production. And a colleague of mine, Zach Luther and Scott Swinton, asked farmers, like, would they be willing to create prairie strips and how much money would they need to do so? And so the horizontal axis here is the probability of having a contract for prairie strips, and depending on the payment offer. And if the offer is at this star, which is the amount paid by the Conservation Reserve Program, then 20% of farmers would install prairie strips. And we see that rate kind of going up over time. Okay, so prairie strips is one approach to landscape conservation we use. And then the other is, what about conservation in broader working landscapes and for other kinds of organisms, not just pollinators? And so another part of my research is to ask about what we call landscape corridors, connecting habitats to the landscape. And if these corridors work, well, they're going to be superhighways for plants and animals. And then if they're superhighways for plants and animals, we'd hope that they'd increase the size of the population and increase the diversity of species. And so, again, I'm an experimental ecologist, and I work with the U.S. Forest Service in pine woodlands, plantation forests in South Carolina. And so I worked in South Carolina at a place called the Savannah River Site, and each of these orange dots is where we've done our experiments. And what we do with the Forest Service is ask them to create a network of fragments in the landscape that are either connected by corridors or not. So each replicate landscape has one center area that's 1 hectare, 2.5 acres, connected by 150 meters to another one of these fragments. And then there are other fragments that are isolated. And we can ask, what is the change in movement between fragments, and how does that change diversity? And so just to give you a sense what the experiment looks like, the native habitat in this region is longleaf pine savanna. So it's mainly a grassland with just a few trees growing. So what we were going for is what we see on the left, open grasslands with trees, pine plantations surrounding. And people ask me, well, why not look at forested corridors? Well, in this landscape, this is what the forest understory looks like. The pines are planted so densely that they keep out the much of the rest of biodiversity. And so we're looking from the forest out into the diverse and productive openings. Okay, so we first asked, are these corridors superhighways for animals? And I was looking at whether they were affecting movement of butterflies. And so so people ask, like, how do you track butterflies through the landscape? Well, we catch them and just mark them with a magic marker, a Sharpie pen on their wings, giving them a number or a barcode, and then we know where we caught them. We know where we capture them after they've moved through the landscape. And so this little graphic is showing the butterflies that move between one fragment and another that's either connected by a corridor or not connected. And then on the Y vertical axis is the proportion of butterflies that have moved. And what you can see is that more butterflies move through landscapes connected by corridors. This was true for one butterfly, but we looked since at many, many more types of organisms. And so here I'm showing some of the animals we looked at, including butterflies. Oh, let me describe this graphic. So I'm going to show you species on the horizontal axis and the percent increase of movement on the vertical axis. And a key point here is that a value of 100% increase means a doubling in the movement rate. And across what I'm going to show you, the effects are generally very large. And so for butterflies, the common buckeye and variegated fritillary, and for another pollinator, the carpenter bee, there was an increase in movement between connected patches. That was true for small mammals. We studied a native mouse and rat. It was true for pollen. So we actually tracked pollen movement from flower to flower using a dye powder for several plant species. And it was true for dispersal of plants. So these plants with the green bars are plants that are dispersed by birds. So they're fruiting plants. It's also, it turns out, true for wind dispersed plants. There's a broad effect of corridors as superhighways for animals. And so then we asked, well, if the corridors are increasing dispersal, do they increase diversity? And I had this student, former student, my first student actually, Ellen Damshin, who surveyed for the diversity of plants in our fragments. And here she's got one of these squares, a quadrat, where she monitored diversity, but she didn't have just one of these. She had well over 1,000 through the landscape and did surveys for a number of plant species. And you could tell, like if you can see well on the slide, she has a big smile on her face, a big smile. And that's probably an indication that she was in her first year of graduate school. But she actually continued on this work, continued through graduate school, continued after. Now she's a professor at University of Wisconsin. And we still work closely together because we're seeing interesting responses of the corridors on biodiversity. And so here on the horizontal axis, I have years since we created the experiment. And on the vertical axis is the difference in number of species between connected fragments and unconnected fragments. So what does this mean? A positive number means more species of plants in connected fragments. Negative means less species in connected fragments. And there's no significant difference in the first year, which is good, meaning we didn't put our experiment in places that would bias our results. But very quickly, the number of plant species in connected fragments increased relative to those in unconnected fragments, to the point where by about 10 years into the study, there were 15 to 20 more plant species in connected fragments. Well, there's about 100 plant species total in any of these fragments. So we're talking about a huge increase, 20% of plant species. I have disturbance here because these habitats are maintained by fires every few years. And so we work with the Forest Service to put in controlled burns. And we thought after about 10 years, like maybe we've reached the limit. Maybe corridors can have no more effect than the big effect they've already had. But we kept tracking through time. And in fact, the effect of corridors has increased now over 2 decades. And we don't know where the end of the effect will be. So reconnecting landscapes can have positive effects for biodiversity. Okay, so my last just few slides are some pictures about landscape corridors. Because now I'm going from my world that's in experiments and managed landscapes to thinking about, well, where do these corridors make sense for people? And so I just have a few pictures, and I work in an agricultural landscape, and I was thinking, well, what does an agricultural landscape look like where I think of it as mainly corn and soy? This is a Google image, satellite image I took from the state of Iowa. And I think of Iowa as just dominated by corn and soy, and that's all the brown areas in this graphic. But there's other landscape elements that are natural features. And so these can be buffers along rivers. They can be roadways that have natural areas along them. They can be prairie strips or terraces through agricultural fields. So there is like a template on which to build connected landscapes. And Iowa is a particularly good example because they have a living roadways program where roadside right-of-ways are seeded with native plants to recreate prairie or prairie lake habitat. And so those areas provide a huge potential area to do conservation, including conservation for pollinators. And there are these other kinds of landscape corridors. Now I'm going on, I mean, we can see lots of them in urban settings, but here I've got a big example from Tel Aviv where there's a corridor running through the heart of the city. It's along a riverway, but it's providing, people put it in, why? For water quality, they put it in for recreational areas, but they also serve as homes for biological diversity and for benefits of ecosystems for people. Okay, so I'll stop there by first putting in a plug for a website that my lab runs called conservationcorridor.org. And there we talk about all sorts of ways that, all sorts of new areas at the forefront of science of corridors, landscape corridors, and at the management of landscape corridors. And there, it's done at trying to distill key nuggets to 200 word, we call them digests, but that just keep people up on the state of the science. And with that, I want to thank the people who really make this project come. I have many collaborators, but at the station I work, Kellogg Biological Station, we're a long-term ecological research site. So we've been going for almost 40 years. And we're also now, for the last few years, a long-term agroecosystem research site and sponsored by the National Science Foundation. So that's what I've got. And I'd love to, I'm going to stop sharing, but I can go back and say, look, I've got time for questions or discussion. And I see one question with what are the Ohio butterfly data from iNaturalist? That's a great question because no, it's not. It's a project set up by the Ohio Lepidopterus, the Society of Ohio Lepidopterus, but people that do what I do are more and more extracting data from iNaturalist. And so there's a few states that have big programs, and another one is in California. But one of their most recent papers looked at the convergence of results between one of these long-term studies where areas have been sampled every year for 4 decades, and what people are finding in abundances from iNaturalist. And it turns out in California, guess what? There's a decline in butterfly abundances of 2% per year. And the data from these dedicated studies line up pretty well with data from iNaturalist.
Awesome. There are 2 other questions in the chat. The first is from Deborah. Any research on the reason for decreasing butterfly numbers being related to adaptation, shifting, and or moving to more favorable environments as the landscapes are adapting or shifting or going through natural succession processes?
Okay, so all right. Where my mind was going at the first part of this question is in response to climate change, where we think a lot about how climates are changing and how species might adapt. And I'm glad you asked this question because my call this morning, 2 hours ago before this call started, was with the Fish and Wildlife Service and some collaborators where we're doing work on a rare butterfly called Mitchell's satyr. And Mitchell's satyr is found in Michigan, Alabama, and Mississippi, nowhere in between, right? Okay, so you've got these places that are, I think, 600 miles apart, south and north. And the question is, as climate changes, like, will the Michigan butterflies be able to deal with the warmer temperatures? And so we're asking questions about the potential of adaptation, including if we, through restoration, bred the Michigan and Alabama butterflies and then seeded those into restoration areas. My colleague, Sarah Fitzpatrick, is an expert in what's called genetic rescue. And so taking advantage of the genetic diversity across populations, I'll say, to rescue populations that might be in decline. So thanks for asking that question. I hope that's just like one angle of this, but one that's like right at the forefront of my mind right now.
Awesome. And then it looks like there's one more question, which is from Becca. Is there a good resource for finding the most beneficial pollinator or habitat enhancing plants in our area if we're looking to maximize pollinator fodder? I manage lots of small spaces, green roofs, in an urban setting totaling approximately 23 acres. Would love to support wildlife migration.
So that's a great question. There's different answers to that. So you can go to Princeton University Press. I forget the authors, but they put out a book on butterfly gardening, which I think is a great resource. But that's a great resource in general. But then you're asking about, well, how do I bring this down to my specific area? And there, it can often depend on two groups, maybe three. Well, three. I mean, there's the professional landscape designers who've thought about this extensively, but then also university, I'll just say extension, but more applied groups often put out pamphlets about this. I know I was at North Carolina State before at Michigan State, and we developed a pamphlet just on this topic. And then we, for our work in Michigan, have developed through kind of bringing out lots of other kind of more detailed mechanistic studies, drawn out the plants that optimize performance for pollinators or other things. And we work very closely with the native pollinator, native plant propagation company, Native Connections. And it's kind of this nice back and forth where we've done some of the science and then we go to them and ask, what mix could you develop? And they come back and say, like, we've done this or that, and these things work great, these things don't. And then we can find an exchange to hone our approach. But that's not really where you want to go. You don't want to be like getting into the weeds, I don't think. But I think starting with the butterfly gardening book that I mentioned, like I said, I remember the press. I don't remember the authors. That's terrible. But then I'm pretty sure that the land grant colleges in your state, like Michigan State, have resources to go to that would help guide the way. Wish I could say something else that was more state or even region within state specific, but I don't have a good way to guide you.
Awesome.
Well, thanks, Julia.
Someone has posted the link to the Princeton Press in the chat. Thank you so much, Juliet.
And that one just came out a few years ago, so it's pretty up to date.
Nice. If there are any more questions, please raise your hand, unmute yourself, type it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm posting in the chat right now a link to today's survey. ELA loves to improve anytime we can, so this survey is really, really important to keep bringing you quality education. And I will also post the chat to the information on this year's annual conference. We have all of the speaker information up currently, so feel free to check that out. If you have any questions, feel free to email Peggy at ecolandscaping.org for more questions about webinars, the conference, or anything else. Thank you so much, Dr. Haddad, Nick, for your time today. It was incredible, fascinating.
Thank you.
You listen to that Radiolab episode right now. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining. Really appreciate the chance to chat with you all.